Picture this. You're sitting in a quiet cafe, minding your own business, maybe working on your laptop or scrolling through your phone. Suddenly, someone approaches you with intentions that make your skin crawl. You politely decline. They persist. You firmly say no. They grab you, and when you try to defend yourself, they strike you so hard that you hit the ground bleeding. Now here's the real question. What happens next? Does justice actually prevail, or does the system protect the aggressor because they're too valuable to lose? What I am about to share with you is a story that answers that question in the most unexpected way possible. It's about power, accountability, and what happens when someone finally says, enough is enough. Trust me, you'll want to hear how this unfolds. Just beyond the entrance of one of America's largest military installations, there was a little coffee shop that had become something of a sanctuary. It was one of those rare places where the rigid hierarchy of military life seemed to melt away. At least temporarily. Officers and enlisted personnel alike would gather there, trading their uniforms and ranks for a brief taste of normalcy. The atmosphere was always relaxed, friendly even. People laughed, chatted about their lives outside the base, and for a moment, they were just regular folks grabbing a cup of coffee. But on this particular afternoon, that peaceful atmosphere shattered in an instant. There was a young woman sitting alone near the window, her attention focused on the laptop screen in front of her. She wore civilian clothes, nothing flashy or attention-grabbing, just comfortable everyday wear. She had that quiet, focused demeanor of someone deep in concentration, the kind of person who blends into the background of any public space. In military towns, many women adopted this approach, a sort of protective invisibility that helped them avoid unwanted attention. She seemed perfectly content in her solitude, typing away, occasionally sipping her coffee, completely absorbed in whatever project occupied her screen. Then, he walked in. Staff Sergeant Derek Coleman carried himself with an unmistakable swagger, the kind that came from years of getting away with behavior that should have ended his career long ago. 8 years in uniform had given him a false sense of invincibility. Behind him trailed a reputation that everyone on base knew about, even if they only spoke of it in hushed tones. There had been complaints, 3 formal ones, that somehow vanished into thin air, erased or buried by people who apparently thought protecting one man was more important than protecting the people he targeted. The whispers followed him everywhere. People knew what he was capable of, what he'd done, but the system had failed repeatedly to hold him accountable. So he continued, emboldened by each incident that resulted in nothing more than a slap on the wrist. Coleman spotted the woman and made his approach. What happened next unfolded quickly, but every person in that cafe would remember it in vivid detail for the rest of their lives. He started with aggressive advances that she politely declined, but Coleman wasn't the type to accept rejection gracefully. His face darkened. His body language shifted from cocky to threatening. She told him firmly to leave her alone, her voice steady despite the situation. That's when he crossed the line. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to leave marks. She pulled away, and in that moment, she did something crucial. She pulled out her phone and started recording, documenting what was happening in real time. That's when Coleman lost control completely. His hand flew across her face with such force that the crack of impact silenced every single conversation in the room. The blow knocked her from her chair, and as she fell, her head struck the corner of the table. The sound of it made everyone freeze. For a split second, the entire cafe seemed suspended in time, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. Then, chaos erupted. 2 young soldiers, barely out of basic training by the looks of them, immediately rushed forward. They grabbed Coleman, pulling him back as he screamed obscenities, his face twisted with rage. The shop owner frantically dialed base security, his hands shaking as he spoke into the phone. Meanwhile, the woman sat on the floor, blood trickling from a cut above her eye, her hands trembling but still holding her phone steady. The camera was still recording. Despite the pain, despite the shock, despite the blood, her expression showed something remarkable. Her face had gone pale, but her jaw was set with absolute determination. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't crying. She was making sure everything was documented. And Coleman, he actually laughed, even with 2 soldiers restraining him, even with a room full of witnesses staring at him in horror. He laughed. He'd played this game before, knew all the moves. His company commander would step in, smooth things over, frame it as a misunderstanding or an overreaction. Maybe he'd get some extra duty assignments, have to fill out some paperwork, but nothing serious would come of it. That's how it always worked. Women would file complaints, reports would be written up, investigations would be promised, and then everything would quietly disappear. He was too experienced, too connected, too valuable to the unit. That's what he'd been told, what the pattern had proven time and again. So why would this time be any different? Base security arrived within minutes, their response time impressive. They began the standard procedures, taking statements from witnesses, separating the involved parties, documenting the scene. Coleman maintained that smug expression, even as they escorted him to their vehicle, that knowing smirk that suggested he wasn't worried in the slightest. The woman, meanwhile, initially refused medical attention. She insisted that the priority was documentation, that every witness statement needed to be recorded properly, that nothing could be overlooked or dismissed. The security officers found themselves compelled to be extraordinarily thorough, though they couldn't quite articulate why. There was something about a voice, a quiet authority that made them take extra care with every detail. 17 minutes later, everything changed. 3 black SUVs pulled up to the base commander's office, their arrival urgent and purposeful. Out stepped 3 generals, their faces carved from stone, their movements conveying both fury and absolute determination. Leading them was a woman wearing 3 stars, General Patricia Morrison. Her eyes carried something that made seasoned soldiers instinctively straighten their posture. It was the cold fury of a mother, combined with the calculated rage of a commander who'd just discovered a cancer within her ranks. Within the hour, the entire installation went into lockdown. No one in, no one out. The base commander, a full colonel who'd been about to head out for his afternoon golf game, suddenly found himself standing rigidly at attention, while 3 generals methodically tore through every file. Every complaint, every conveniently buried report related to Staff Sergeant Derek Coleman and the entire command structure that had enabled him. They weren't just investigating one incident, they were unraveling a system. Because here's the thing that Coleman didn't know, the crucial piece of information that would have changed everything if he'd known it before approaching that woman in the cafe. She wasn't just any civilian working on her laptop. Her name was Captain Jennifer Morrison, and she was currently on leave recovering from injuries sustained during a classified operation somewhere in Eastern Europe. She was a decorated officer with an exemplary service record, and she was General Patricia Morrison's daughter. But here's what makes this even more significant. Jennifer hadn't relied on her mother's rank or influence throughout her entire military career. In fact, she deliberately refused any special treatment, insisting on earning every promotion, every assignment, every commendation through her own merit. She'd gone out of her way to ensure that no one could ever claim she'd received advantages because of her family connection. She wanted to serve as any other soldier would, facing the same challenges, held to the same standards. That afternoon in the coffee shop, Jennifer hadn't been working on just any project. She was deep into research for her master's thesis in military justice, specifically examining how sexual assault and harassment complaints mysteriously disappeared within the military system. Her research wasn't just academic, it was deeply personal, driven by countless stories she'd heard from fellow servicewomen, by the patterns she'd recognized, by a system she'd sworn to change from within. She'd been documenting case after case of complaints that vanished, of perpetrators who faced no consequences, of a culture that protected predators while abandoning victims. Coleman's assault was his final and fatal mistake. Jennifer's recording, combined with the statements from every witness in that cafe, combined with the investigation launched by those 3 generals, began unraveling a web of corruption and complicity that went far deeper than anyone initially realized. They discovered an entire network of protected predators, commanders who systematically buried complaints to maintain their unit's promotion rates and readiness statistics. They uncovered a culture that had allowed men like Coleman to operate with impunity, hunting victims while their superiors looked the other way or actively covered for them. By evening, Coleman was in custody, facing both military and civilian charges. The smirk had completely vanished from his face. His company commander was relieved of duty, career effectively over. The battalion commander found himself under formal investigation. And then something remarkable happened. 7 other soldiers came forward with their own complaints. People who'd stayed silent because they'd lost faith in the system, who'd been convinced that speaking up would only make things worse for them. But now, seeing that someone was actually listening, that the system might finally function the way it was supposed to, they found the courage to step forward. General Morrison stood beside her daughter in the base hospital that evening, watching as medics finally treated the cut above Jennifer's eye. Jennifer had genuinely tried to handle everything through proper channels, the way any other soldier would. She hadn't wanted to use her family connection, hadn't wanted her mother's intervention, but her mother taught her a different lesson that day, one that would shape her understanding of leadership forever. Sometimes rank exists, not for privilege, but for protection. Not for personal gain, but for the power to fix broken systems that destroy good people. Sometimes the right thing to do is to use whatever tools and authority you have to create the change that should have happened long ago. The lockdown lasted 3 days. During that time, Fort Benning underwent a transformation. When restrictions finally lifted, the installation had new leadership, new protocols for handling complaints, and most importantly, a new culture of accountability. Everyone from the newest recruit to the most senior officer received the message loud and clear. No one was untouchable anymore. Every complaint mattered, whether it came from the daughter of a general or the newest private fresh out of training. Everyone deserved the same protection, the same justice, the same respect. Coleman's journey from that smug smirk to the reality of his situation had been swift and devastating. He'd finally learned what should have been taught to him years earlier, what the system should have enforced long before he hurt so many people. Actions have consequences. Some lines should never be crossed, and eventually, accountability catches up with everyone. This story raises uncomfortable questions that extend far beyond one installation or one incident. How many other predators operate within systems that protect them? How many complaints get buried by people more concerned with statistics and appearances than with justice? How many victims stay silent because they've learned that speaking up changes nothing? And what does it take to finally break these cycles of abuse and complicity? The answer isn't simple, but this story offers a glimpse of what's possible when people refuse to accept broken systems. When someone with the power to create change decides to use that power. When victims find the courage to document and report despite knowing the system has failed others before them. When witnesses step forward instead of looking away. When accountability finally matters more than protecting institutions or individuals. Change is possible, but it requires people willing to fight for it, willing to risk comfort and convenience to do what's right. It requires systems that support victims instead of protecting perpetrators. It requires leadership that values justice over image, that recognizes protecting one person's career is never worth destroying someone else's life. If this story resonated with you, if you believe accountability matters, if you think systems need to protect victims rather than predators, share this message. Talk about why these issues matter. Support people who speak up despite the risks. And remember that change happens when enough people decide that what has been acceptable for too long, won't be tolerated anymore.